Okay, so in this mind wrap, we are going to be looking at an experimental study. So in the last one, we talked about correlational studies. This time we're going to talk about experimental studies. So let's start off with some definitions here. So an experimental study is a study in which participants are randomly assigned to different groups, i.e. the experimental and control. By the way, we can have more than one experimental group when we are doing a study. If we're looking at some type of medication and we have two different versions of it, we might have two different experimental groups and still the one control group. Anyway. In order to determine the causal effect of a certain condition, we call our independent variable, on a certain outcome, we call our dependent variable. And we're going to talk more about these variables and give you some definitions here in just a second. But the basic idea of an experimental study is we are separating our participants randomly. We are doing some form of manipulation to a variable, and then we are measuring a separate variable to see if there is an outcome there, different from our population. So the goal of an experiment is to determine a cause and effect relationship between two variables. An experiments attempt to control other variables to prevent them from influencing the results. Those are our extraneous variables we were talking about in the previous video that the correlational studies cannot control for or don't typically control for. We do try to control for those in experimental studies. So those could be just differences from one participant to the other, like age, weight, skill level, personality, motivation. So you might give everybody in your study a personality exam to make sure they're as similar as possible, or as similar to the population that you're studying as possible. So, and there are definitely some other things that come into play when we talk about experimental studies and influencing variables. So let's look at some terminology. Let's start out with the independent variable. This is the variable being manipulated by the researcher. So this is the one we're trying to mess around with and see if it has an effect on our dependent variable, which is the variable that we are observing to assess the effect of the treatment. Okay, so we talked about the control group or the control condition. These are individuals who do not receive a treatment. We also have the term placebo treatment. This is anything that seems like real medical treatment but isn't. So you'll hear people say that they gave them a placebo. This is what we're talking about. We think it's actual medication, but it's not. We do this in medical studies to see if it is the medicine actually works or if it is the mind that is making the medicine work. So it's a really kind of strange concept to look into. And the last is our experimental condition, our experimental group. These are individuals who actually receive the treatment. Now, let's look at a possible design. So let's say we're looking at the influence of violent video games and non-violent video games on children. So the first thing we would do is, let's say we had 50 children, and we would randomly separate them into group A and group B, trying as hard as we can to make those groups equivalent to each other. That prevents a lot of issues. So then group A gets violent video games and group B gets non-violent video games. And then we do a white noise administration to see how they respond to the white noise. Does it increase their anger? Does it decrease? Things of that nature. We would then measure that as our outcome, trying to determine if the people who were in the violent games were more prone to violent after effects. So that could be something we could do. Now, let's talk about some advantages to experimental studies. So experimental studies provide the research with a high level of control because you can control all of the outside variables because you are specifically measuring certain things. So you do get a lot of control. They provide conclusions that are specific. So very specific conclusions because you are studying a very specific sample or population. It does allow the researcher to make generalizations back to the population. Obviously, there are some caveats to that, but we can do that. And it is also used in multiple fields, not just in psychology, but in a lot of different places. Education does a lot of experimental research projects as well. So some disadvantages. It is definitely subject to human error, both on the researcher and the subject side of the house on that. We do have some ways to control that. We call them blind and double-blind studies. Blind studies means that the participant does not know which group they're assigned to, whether they're assigned to the experimental or control. A blind or a double-blind study means that neither the researcher nor the participant knows which group they're in. So that allows to kind of control some of the error that could happen inside of that study. It creates some unrealistic situations. If you've ever seen some of the videos or some of the experiments done in the 70s and 80s, they have a lot of things where people are put into very unrealistic situations to see how they react to them, where you normally wouldn't be put in that situation on a day-to-day basis. So there are some unrealistic situations, which makes that not very generalizable. There are some ethical and practical problems with variable control. Typically when we do an experiment of any type, or actually even a correlation of any type, we have to fill out what we call an IRB, which is a institutional review board. So this allows the university that we're doing the research through to examine whether or not our research will be ethical to other people, and to determine whether or not we can actually proceed forward with our experiment. Extraneous variables cannot always be controlled. Sometimes it's very difficult to control those outside variables. And lastly, they can be both expensive and time-consuming to do an experimental study. So you notice that that was actually a disadvantage to both a correlational and an experimental study, at least the time-consuming part. Experimental studies tend to be more expensive than a correlational study can be, because again, correlational studies were not we're not manipulating anything, we're just pulling data. So it's typically not an expensive way to go about a study. So this is our experimental study, just again, a little bit of information about them, about how we look at those. We have a lot of different types of experimental studies. We have what we call a quasi-experimental study, which accounts for not having that random assignment. So when you do an experimental study, one of the biggest things is that the assignment to the groups has to be random. But a lot of times that's not feasible. So we have what we call a quasi-experimental study, where you're not really assigning the participants randomly. Maybe that's one of the biggest ones we use in education, is a quasi-experimental. And there are some other different things that we can do with experimental studies, but a true experimental study, again, random assignment to a experimental and a control group, and then a manipulation of an independent variable and a measurement of a dependent variable. If you have any questions about experimental studies, please make sure to email me.